Once upon a time, in a happy land called Czechoslovakia, there was a loving government with many parties and lots of freedom. This government existed in peace until 1939, when the Nazis stormed in and ruined it all. In 1945, the Red Army came in to save Czechoslovakia and began to infiltrate the government with communist ideas. The government that once had many parties was reduced to a government where only 4 parties had influence. The National Front was an umbrella organization that ruled over the political parties. It prevented legal opposition to the government. Suddenly, the left wing Hulk smashed all the other parties. The twinkly land of Czechoslovakia was now increasingly open to socialization. They became solid allies of the Soviet Union because of the Red Army's occupation and the West abandonment in the 1930s and the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia looked to the Soviet Union for guidance in becoming a socialist and then communist nation. Tensions with the West rose when the Czech government opposed German rearmament, and the West retaliated by canceling a large loan.
As the elections came around in 1946, the happy land got a little sadder as a red cloud covered the sunshine. Now, 38% of votes in the May 1946 elections went to the communists. They were now the strongest emerging political organization. A frisky fellow by the name of Clement Gottwald was selected to be premier on July 3, 1946. Dun dun dun. In 1947, Beignets was unfortunately weakened by 2 strokes and granted a government of 12 communists, 7 communist sympathizers, and only 2 non-communist heroes. Were they going to be strong enough to oppose the imposing Hulk smash? The loyal Czech troops were ready to spring into action to utilize their force, yet Beignets refused them to act in fear of Soviet intervention. People began to be happy again as Gottwald's early actions appeared as sweet as gumdrops. A new constitution created guaranteed free elections, a free press, freedom of religion, equal rights for women, and an independent judiciary. Basic industries were to be socialized, yet the private property and private enterprises of moderate size were to be protected. Yet Beignets refused this new constitution, and things got heated. In 1948, the split government couldn't live in peace anymore, and the non-communists charged the communists with planning assassinations and other illegal actions. At the same time, a nymph named Truman created the Marshall Plan, and Czech conservatives considered accepting the aid from the foreign enemy. The evil bear Stalin had a Czech government official defenestrated for their possible acceptance of democratic aid. Gottwald needed to mobilize his party now to demonstrate his power. Action committees seized control. Things were in turmoil as the army and police arrested conspirators and the angered factory workers went on strike. These forces were too strong for Beignets as he decided to give in to the evil Gottwald and pass a new constitution providing a single-list electoral ballot and a new parliament that was 2/3 communist. In 1948, the single-party dictatorship completed the nationalization and collectivization process.
Life was very sad for the Czechs under communist rule. The government took away their personal rights and kicked out over 2 million of their sauerkraut-loving friends after confiscating the property. The economy was nationalized and began to steadily decline, getting worse and worse until the point of social upheaval. Shortly after the coup, political trials began. Those who were viewed as opposition were put on trial and possibly executed. Riots began, leaving people upset and in need of change. This change finally began in 1966, when the leaders shifted control of the industry from the government to the local organizations in an attempt to improve the economy. The red clouds began to part in 1968, when Alexander Dubček, secretary of the Communist Party, began to implement socialism with the human face. The personal rights were given back, and the economic control was shifted from the central government to local organizations in an attempt to revitalize the economy. The Czechs were happy, and this period became known as the Prague Spring. The relations with the West improved, and the spring was considered a brief thaw in the Cold War. As the Czechs' life improved, they failed to notice the Soviet threat looming above their heads. The other satellite countries began to fear the security of communism in their states due to the more democratic nature of the communism in Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring rapidly shifted back to winter as the Soviet bear Brezhnev sent his bear army from the Warsaw Pact to occupy Czechoslovakia and remove their hero Dubček. The hero was taken away to USSR, arrested, and then kicked out of the Communist Party. He left behind his country in a state of despair as USSR began the process of normalization to return Czechoslovakia to a purely communistic nation. As the period of clear skies ended, the red clouds began to cover the sun once again. Leaders in the West expressed opposition to the heavy-handed Soviet response, but did nothing to intervene and save the nation. The Czechs' period of happiness ended and returned back to a nation of riots and protests. In this time period, the most well-known protest occurred. It was the suicide of Jan Palach, a student of Charles University, who lit himself on fire on Prague's Wenceslas Square in January 1968. The brief springtime was only a temporary thaw in the Cold War. The relations froze back over at the flip of a communist switch.
Following the Prague Spring, an era of normalization occurred over the 1970s and 80s to restore the harsh communist ways. Gustav Husak had now succeeded Alexander Dubček as the leader of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia in 1969. Husak had to quiet the opposition so that Soviet leaders like the Bear Brezhnev would allow him to make domestic policies to improve the sad country. Husak then purged political reformists, allowed religious persecution, and oversaw mass arrests of intellectuals and artists. Any opposition to this was kept in secret underground operations, one of which was released into the public, the publication of Charter 77. The manifesto was published in Western Germany in January 1977 that declared the importance and the protection of civil rights that Czechs deserved. This momentous document tested Husak, who proceeded to ban its publication in Czechoslovakia and arrested its hundreds of supporters. The times were changing in the late 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev was the new leader of the Communist Party, doing anything he could to keep the USSR together. The Czechs took this opportunity to protest their government once again and started the Velvet Revolution on November 17, 1989, when students marched around Prague demanding democratic reforms. Other citizens joined in to partake in the revolution that lasted for weeks, though the protests became more violent with each passing day. This all led up to Husak and the entire Communist Party resigning on November 24, 1989, their troops leaving 2 years later. After that, political parties formed and the first free democratic elections took place in 1990, Václav Havel winning the presidency. On January 1, 1993, Czechoslovakia officially split into two independent states, the Czech Republic and the Slavic Republic. After a long journey together, dealing with nymphs, bears, and angry townspeople, the two republics were now free of the big red cloud and lived happily ever after.